Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we work our way around the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery's Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as M. So I'm starting us off with milk. Disclaimer to start off with, I'm not doing anything about breast milk or breastfeeding because we have done that already when we did our breast episode of our Head to Toe series. So I'm looking at milk consumption and all the different ways that sort of took place in history. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there is evidence of human consumption of non-human milk very, very long time ago, 6,000 years ago, the earliest periods of farming. That is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to move very quickly onwards to the much more recent history. In our C episode, we talked about coffee and the rise of coffee consumption in Europe, and milk consumption really goes along with that. So the rise of coffee houses in the 17th and 18th centuries is when you really then get a rise of milk drinking as well. And it gets a lot more complicated when you get into that sort of time period. So earlier milk consumption you would live on a farm, you would have a cow or a goat, you would drink its milk. But when people start living in urban areas, you start getting cows and goats packed in to tiny stables and being kept up alleyways and living in all sorts of very unpleasant environments. And this led to milk becoming something which was much less healthy. You would get blue tinted milk, which was known as swill milk, which was, because of the diet of the cows, would then be quite an unpleasant thing to drink. So it was thickened and it was coloured with chalk to try and make it look like the sort of milk that people wanted to drink. And this was not healthy. This was not a good thing to be drinking. So industrial milk you would get in 19th century in a city was quite different from the sort of lovely milk that you would get in nice rural places. The first glass milk bottles were patented in 1884. And prior to that, the way that you would typically buy milk was out of a bucket. There would be milkmen who would either stand on the streets or go door to door with their bucket, and they would ladle milk into your bowl or your whatever device you had to store the milk. So yes, milkmen were delivering milk by bucket, this sort of coloured blue tinted milk. And that is what you would be drinking.
That sounds disgusting.
It does. Blue milk. Yeah.
I mean, blue top milk, sure. Blue milk? No.
Yeah. Blue milk, but you wouldn't know because they would then colour it with chalk.
Oh yeah. Secret blue milk.
As a Scottish person of a certain age, in the more modern era, I do think of Margaret Thatcher when we start talking about milk in the modern day.
Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher?
Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher. So the reason why we talk about Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher is that in the early 20th century in Britain, in 1933, the Milk Marketing Board was set up and they were promoting milk. There were advertising campaigns, which some people will possibly remember. They were mostly from the 1990s, was a really big era of milk marketing. both in Britain and in America, where they had I think America was called Got Milk, and then they had celebrities that had sort of milk mustaches. But it also subsidized milk in schools. So since 1933, there was this subsidized milk which was provided free to all primary school children. And when Margaret Thatcher became Education Secretary, the government removed the free milk from schools. And that was unsurprisingly quite controversial. And that resulted in the Thatcher milk snatcher phrase. To go on a slight tangent, when I was thinking about milk, I also started thinking about ice cream and the history of ice cream. This has a very non-Western history. So the first ice cream that we know of, originated in China around 700 AD. It was sort of a bit more like a frozen yogurt, but it was essentially, it was an ice cream. It then came about 1500 to Italy, and then France and Spain. It's nearly 200 years before it then makes it to Britain. We were quite slow in adopting that. King Charles II apparently was supposed to have been the first person to have ice cream in Britain. And obviously, a lot of the reason for this slowness is we are not countries that naturally have a lot of ice, except at very certain times of year. And you need ice, and you can't make ice at that time. So it's very difficult to get your hands on. And so in the 19th century, ice begins to be imported into Europe from Norway and even from Canada and America. Huge pieces of ice are brought over and then sold in streets in London and so on. Ice would be shipped down the Thames and used to be sold on the streets. One that I thought was particularly, perhaps not disgusting, but just not something that I fancy, is something called the penny lick, which you could buy on the streets in Victorian London. You paid a penny for either a glass or a stick of ice cream. You would lick it clean, give it back, and then they would just use it on the next person. And there was no washing really involved, as far as I can tell. So you're just sort of passing around this lick between many people.
No.
That was a very expressive noise, Olivia. I feel like you have feelings.
Yes, that just, revolting.
Yeah, you
Revolting.
have no idea. You have absolutely no idea who the last licker was of this.
What an interesting phrase.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna make that my trademark. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of milk was babies. So as I said before, I'm not going to talk about breastfeeding. I'm not going to talk about human milk, but baby formula milk. So the powdered milk first was developed in the 1860s. So this is, in theory, powdered cow milk, but it was so adulterated with so many things that you really didn't particularly know what you were buying at that time. So it was hugely popular. So it was first developed in the 1860s. By the 1880s, there are at least 30 different brands of baby milk formula. So there's a real market for it. But the use of formula would often result in deficiencies. So things like scurvy, rickets, malnutrition. If you were not using breast milk, but you were using this formula, it had so many implications. And a big part of it is you just don't really know what is in this product that you're buying. There was typically a lot of fat in them, and so it would make babies quite fat fairly often. And especially in the Victorian period, they liked a fat baby. They thought a chubby baby was a sign of health. But you can be chubby and still be malnourished if the other things that you need are not in that product, because they didn't really understand things like vitamins. So people started giving lots supplements. So you'd give baby formula, but you would also give your baby orange juice or cod liver oil or various other supplements to try and make up for what the formula lacked. So you were still only making them as healthy as breast milk would be, but you would have to do it with not only the powdered milk, but a bunch of other supplements to try and get yourself up to the level of health that breast milk would have. I should say there's absolutely no judgment from me about anything to do with 21st century, different milks for babies. We're very much talking about the 1800s and the problems then. But there were so many problems with this formula milk that what people would sometimes do as a supplement would be to just have a goat or a donkey. And that was quite common in foundling hospitals or orphanages where there would be a lot of babies. Rather than buying this formula and then worrying about the supplements, you would just buy a goat or a donkey and feed the baby directly from that. And that could be the best way of getting the balance that you needed.
Would those goats and donkeys be better kept in the 1800s than the cows with the blue milk were?
It would depend on the size and scale of the operation. So there are some foundling hospitals and orphanages which were funded by very wealthy bequests, very wealthy people. And so they would have land. And you can still see that now in some of these grand buildings that were foundling hospitals, that yes, they would probably be well kept because they had lawns, they had gardens, they had lots of space. But if it was a tiny, tiny, sort of Orphan Annie type setup, they wouldn't have the land to keep these animals well. So basically, sometimes is a very unhelpful response to that. It depends. So, Olivia, what's your M?
My M is Mercury. So this is a very big topic, and I'm going to do my very best to keep it tight and short and specific. So here we go. Mercury is a heavy metal. It's also known as quicksilver, and it's the only metallic element that's liquid at room temperature. It was formerly called hydrogyrum from the Greek words hydro, meaning water, and agyrus, meaning silver, which is why its atomic symbol is Hg. In medieval alchemy, the 7 known metals, quicksilver, gold, silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin, were associated with the 7 planets, and quicksilver was associated with the fastest planet, which had been named after the Roman god Mercury, who was associated with speed and mobility, and so that's why we call it quicksilver. Alchemists thought Mercury was the first matter from which all metals were formed, and they believed that different metals could be produced by varying the quality and quantity of sulfur contained within the mercury. So the medicinal use of mercury is sort of very closely aligned with alchemy and documented in medical and alchemical texts from across the ancient world. The most common natural source of mercury is mercuric sulfide, which is also called cinnabar, which has been in use since the Neolithic age. Primarily prehistoric use of cinnabar was to grind it down and create vermilion paint. It was used in cave paintings, but also as decorative paint well into the current millennium. But the ancient Greeks used cinnabar in ointments, the ancient Egyptians and the Romans used it in cosmetics. In ancient China, the Emperor Qin Shi Huang was reportedly killed by drinking mercury and powdered jade, which was in a mixture formulated by his physicians as an intended elixir of immortality. So, because of its mercury content, cinnabar can be toxic to human beings. There's also evidence to suggest overexposure to mercury was seen as an occupational disease by the ancient Romans. They knew of its toxicity, but it was still a common product to be used in a variety of things for general life, including medicine. So that's like my brief overview.
Miss, can I ask a question? So if you're
Yes.
putting mercury, thank you. So if you're putting mercury on your eyelids, say as a beautiful sort of style, or vermilion, what's it doing to them? It's not good, is it?
No.
Am I going to not want it to know the answer to?
No. Well, okay, so I'm not sure specifically about what it would do to your eyelids, but mercury is a heavy metal, and heavy metal toxicity is pretty bad, we recognize now. The effects of specific mercurial salts would have a certain meaning for people at the time that they were in use. So the main one is something called mercury chloride, which is also known as calomel, and it was described as almost a panacea. So it was used for lots of different things. And its main effect was it was a potent cathartic. and it was really popular for its laxative effect. So yeah, mercury will make you have an urge to go to the toilet.
Beautifully put, thank you.
So the name calomel draws from Greek words again, the words for good and black. And it does turn black in the presence of ammonia, but some people believe that the black part of the name actually comes from the color of the stools that were produced after it was used. Those stools were misunderstood as purged bile, which again was believed to help balance the humors and keep the body healthy. One of the founding fathers of the United States, Dr. Benjamin Rush, was a huge advocate for calomel, and it was his influence that led to calomel being prescribed in what were termed heroic doses. He supplied the Lewis and Clark exhibition with 50 dozen of his own pills known as thunderclappers, meant to treat a number of ailments, and made from a blend of chlorine, the herbal laxative jalap, and 60% mercury. He also thought that mental illness was best treated with calomel, and he suggested that it was good for hypochondria. So I have a quote here, if you want to hear it. He thought that it would work, 1, by abstracting morbid excitement from the brain to the mouth, 2, by removing visceral obstructions, and 3, by changing the cause of our patient's complaints and fixing them wholly upon his sore mouth. The salivation will do still more service if it excites some degree of resentment against the patient's physician or friends. One of the key things there is another effect that mercury has, which is excessive saliva production, causing drooling. In the 16th century, the physician Paracelsus believed effective doses of mercury were achieved when at least 3 pints of saliva were produced, which is, I think, a bit much.
It's a lot. Too much.
Yeah. Arguably, yes. Far too much. During the Victorian period, calomel was available in various forms, including something called blue mass and blue pills, and they were often mixed with a sweet substance like licorice or sugar because they were taken orally. And because neither of them came with a standard dosing, there was no way of knowing how much calomel or mercurius chloride was in each dose, which is somewhat troublesome. The other somewhat contentious thing is that calomel was administered to children as a laxative and a dewormer, and because mercury softened the gums, it was also the principal constituent of teething powders. There was one called Dr. Moffat's Tithena powder, which boasted that it strengthened the child, relieved the bowels, and could temptingly, also as an echo back to your comment about fat babies, it claimed to make baby as fat as a pig, which was apparently a good thing. But babies given calomel for teething often suffered from acrodynia, which can cause all sorts of horrible problems. Calomel in high doses led to mercury poisoning, which could cause permanent deformities and even death. Patients experienced gangrene of the mouth, extreme cramping, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea. And some famous people that took calomel include Napoleon Bonaparte, Edgar Allan Poe, President Andrew Jackson, and Louisa May Alcott.
I love the way there are just some people, and Napoleon's one of them. It's Napoleon, Queen Victoria, I don't know, Mozart or something, who just keep coming back.
Friends of the pod, yeah.
Exactly.
So the thing that most people think of with mercury as well is that it was used to treat syphilis. And that's because it was widely believed that the induced salivation and the diuresis would flush out the syphilitic quote-unquote virus, but also that mercury was used in ointments for skin complaints, and there would often be skin complaints in the early stages of syphilis, ulcers and chancres and rashes. And some historians believe that mercury may have occasionally halted syphilis in the early first stage and reduced the impact on the third stage of syphilis, but it's more likely that any positive effect was due to natural dormant phases. And mercury was eventually replaced by salvarsan, which was an antimicrobial agent developed in the early 1900s. and then eventually penicillin, which became the main treatment from the 1940s. I have one tiny bit more about Mad Hatter's disease.
Oh, do Mad Hatter's disease, definitely.
Probably about 3 sentences, but here we go. So, another thing that people quite often associate with mercury is Mad Hatter's disease or Mad Hatter's syndrome, which is another name for chronic mercury poisoning. And it's called Mad Hatter's disease because the hat makers use mercury to stiffen felt for hats. They used a type of mercury called mercuric nitrate and worked in really poorly ventilated rooms. So over time, they would inhale mercury vapors, which would cause neurological disorders, often characterized by psychosis, excitability, tremors, depression, and anxiety, which led to phrases like mad as a hatter and was the inspiration for Lewis Carroll's character in Alice in Wonderland.
So my M, or my last M of the episode, is menopause. It's tricky and nebulous. It's more nebulous than you would think when you start looking at the history. So I'll start off with what is the menopause. The definition today is that you have typically reached the menopause when your period has stopped for at least 12 months and it's caused by dropping levels of the hormone estrogen. And there are all sorts of symptoms which go along with that, but some people might have a particular combination. So hot flushes, brain fog, mood swings are all elements, but not necessarily everyone will have all these elements. The typical sort of average onset is aged 50, but menopause isn't something that happens very quickly or suddenly. It takes place over a period of time. It develops. It's the sort of peaks and troughs. The menopause is not a specifically human phenomenon. Other mammals also have the menopause. So the specific term menopause, is coined in 1821 by a French physician whose name I'm going to butcher, Charles Pierre Louis Desjardins. And his symptoms were not the symptoms we think of now because they included hysterical or epileptic fits, kleptomania, and nymphomania. So it's one of those diseases or conditions that has changed somewhat over time. And I suppose one of the big changes is the idea that it is a disease. It's not written about a lot in sort of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, early modern period. And some people have argued that the reason why the menopause hasn't been talked about is because people didn't live for as long. The women just weren't living long enough for menopause to become an issue. That seems to be a bit of a fallacy. Although death rates are quite high when you are very young, with babies, with very young children, if you lived into adulthood, you had a very good chance of living into your 70s. So people were certainly experiencing the menopause in significant numbers. But a big chunk of the reason why it isn't written about is because it just isn't seen as a disease. It is part of the cycle of life for a very long time. It's not something which is necessarily seen as being part of the purview of doctors. When people do write about menopause, they are not great about it. So I found an example of a 17th century physician, Nicholas Fontaine, who wrote a book called The Woman's Doctor. And he warned that when women stop menstruating, the feculent and corrupt blood turns rank to poison in the body and putrefies. So his version of what's happening is the blood isn't coming out, but the blood is staying and it's doing something awful.
That sounds very grim.
Disease is growing inside you. Yeah, no, it absolutely does. It's putrid and disgusting, essentially.
Hmm.
And his way of looking at it is very tied into humoral theory. So when you are young, your balance of your body is different, and you are warm and you are wet, and especially as a woman. And as you get older, you get cold and you get dry, and there's health implications that go along with that. That's how they understood the hot flush. You were becoming, that was kind of being pushed out of you. It is fundamentally changing the balance of the humors in your body, and of course, that is a very bad thing. Discussions about menopause often get tied into ideas around witches. All the descriptions, well, not all, but many of the descriptions of witches are basically descriptions of menopausal women. The things that you look for in a witch are really, really similar to the things that you would look for as a diagnosis of a menopausal woman. It's a caricature, of course, it's an extreme version, but as women become infertile, as they become older, they somehow become redundant, they somehow become outside of society, and that makes them very suspicious. And a lot of the stories around witches are them being jealous of young women, jealous of the fertility of young women, jealous of the attributes that they no longer have. And it's about cursing fertile young women, cursing fertile creatures even. So a lot of it's tied to jealousy and revenge as well. It's the old hag, and I don't like that word, but it is a word they use a lot, kind of looming over from the outside and being jealous. So it's menopause has these very negative sort of association in that scenario.
Do you think that because women are aging out of societal expectation and becoming essentially independent of their purpose, which is to create children, that they're kind of demonized?
It's very difficult to say. I read one argument which was that the medicalization of the menopause, which took place in the 18th and 19th centuries, when it becomes a disease in people's minds, happens because older women are no longer useful. There is an argument that in rural places, older women, non-childbearing women, have a role as caregivers for the community, as looking after young children while the young mothers can work on the land, and all those sorts of those women have a place. I'm not saying I agree with this. A lot of the stuff around menopause is almost self-contradictory, because it's like it was this, but also it was the opposite of this. So it's all very theory based. There's not a lot of evidence for it. But that in urban environments, in industrial environments, that sort of community structure, that family structure, that sort of many generations of family structure just goes. And so older women are just a burden, and they are not useful anymore in an industrial economic society. And so that they're just sort of, we need to pathologize these people, we need to push these people out. But the problem with all of this stuff is none of it's ever written down. This is not the sort of thing that people don't sit down and go, today I've decided to pathologize older women because they are inconvenient. So it's all very theoretical, because this is just not, this is so ingrained in society that nobody's actually writing it down. So I don't know.
How annoying.
It is, but it's just one of those things. It's so nebulous. It's so grey. It's so, because it isn't a disease. It's just how people treat old people. It's very nebulous.
What do you think the difference is then between older men and older women? Is it that men have served a greater purpose, like they maybe have accumulated wealth or worked longer or just have more importance in society?
I think, I suppose, men's worth was not seen as tied to their fertility, tied to tangible things like childbirth and fertility in the way that women's were. So, in that context, when men stopped being useful, is not as demarcated, it's not as clear. They could fade out in a way. Whereas women were like, okay, right, the thing has happened. You no longer have value. Um, but again, this is very much my gut feeling rather than evidence based.
I suppose as well that men can have children for a lot longer than women can, so
Men can have children for a lot longer, and their physical work can continue. I think perhaps this is a massive stretch, and I apologize, but perhaps one comparison would be with men who are physically hurt or disabled to a point where they cannot work. That pushes men out in a very dramatic way. Whether it is wounded in wartime or an employment related accident, men's worth is tied much more to their work. So perhaps the equivalent of women not being able to have children anymore would be men not being able to work anymore, in terms of how society viewed them. Because there's certainly a lot of ostracism of men who are disabled. So the first full-length book, specifically just about menopause, focusing on the menopause, dates from 1857, and it's an English physician called Edward Tilt. And he talks about it as the change of life, the critical time, the turn of life for women. So he's viewing it as this very critical moment. And it seems that, his intention is broadly good, that he's talking about the challenges, that women face at this time and how to help and how to treat. But what this really does is it really focuses on the idea of the menopause as a specific disease. It really pathologizes it, and it focuses on how to treat it. And Tilt identifies lots and lots of symptoms, over 100 different symptoms of the menopause that you can look for as a doctor or as a person who's suffering from it. So it ranges from the extreme of full insanity to having a bit of a puffy face, everything in between those two, really, as I say, over 100. And he lists his treatments, and it's a real mixed bag. So on the one end, you have a warm bath and a glass of sherry, quite nice. On the other end, you have suppositories, laxatives, and chloroforming.
Can I take option 1?
Yes, you can. So it's not to say that he was trying to create a disease out of, this life course, but that is essentially the end result. And then the biggest shift after that is in the 20th century, when people begin to understand the hormone deficiency aspect of it. So that's in the 1930s, and the first estrogen product was manufactured in the 1940s. So that's the point when there is a medicine, there is a treatment that you can take for this disease. But yeah, so a lot of it is, even though there are negative opinions around the time of witchcraft and those sorts of discussions, a lot of it is about the progression from this being an inevitable, natural aspect of life that will happen to you, to it becoming a medical complaint, a disease that can then be treated and cured to some extent. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.